Hello, welcome back to the Lingua Loom. Today we're going to start another series which is Tracing the Critics. It is a new series from the Lingua Loom which is about literary criticism. So, before starting all the topics, we will look at the basics, which is what is literary criticism. So, we have to understand what criticism is, its definition, its purpose. Only then we can start that what actually each critic said in their works. So let's start. We'll start with defining the term, which is literary criticism is the reasoned study, evaluation, and interpretation of literary works, encompassing questions of meaning, value, form, historical context, and the relationship between text, author, reader, and society. This is the definition that we evaluate something critically according to its author by keeping in mind their authors, their readers, society, text, and we question values, meanings, form, what it is all about. So the word criticism descends from the Greek "krinein". This is written in ancient Greek. So meaning is to judge, to distinguish. A critic in the original sense is not a fault finder but a discerning judge, someone capable of separating the excellent from the mediocre and explaining why. This is the definition of critic. That someone, it is important to understand that criticism and critic is not a negative term, it is a positive term. They tend to highlight that where are some works lacking and what makes some work even more spectacular as compared to the other ones. So always keep in mind never to take critic or criticism as a negative connotation. So this etymology matters because it restores something important. Criticism is not inherently negative. This is what I'm talking about. It is not negative. You tend to point out certain things so that you can work on them and make them even more elaborated and good as compared to before. So it is an act of careful attention. To criticize a poet is to make it seriously enough to examine how it works, what it says, what it assumes, and whether it succeeds on its own terms or in relation to broader human values. The literary criticism is the effort to understand literature in all its dimensions, which are formal, historical, philosophical, and human. This is one of the most basic definitions that covers the whole crux of literary criticism. So, Terry Eagleton, in the opening of Literary Theory and Introduction, work from 1983, warns that this is the question, what is literature, and by extension, what is criticism, is far less settled than it appears. What counts as literary text, what makes it worth studying, and what matters are legitimate for studying it all are contested questions. The history of literary criticism is in part the history of those contests. Let's move forward, which are the three core activities. So literary criticism is not a single activity. A.H. Abrahams and others distinguish at least three overlapping but distinct operations. So let's look at first is description. Activity number one that you perform while doing a literary criticism is what does the text actually say and do? Identify its features like plot, imagery, meter, syntax, narrative voice without yet evaluating them. So descriptive criticism asks what is here? It resists premature judgment and tries to map the text accurately before drawing conclusions. So new criticism's close reading is primarily descriptive. It is first movement, identify patterns of imagery, paradox, and irony before arguing what they mean. So this is an example listing Keats' use of synesthesia in Ode to the Nightingale before arguing its significance. Then, so this simple means that first you describe what its text is and then you criticize on it. Then interpretation, which is what does the text mean? Constructing a reading, explaining what the text elements signify individually and together. So interpretation is the heart of critical practice. It is never a simple decoding, meaning is not a treasure hidden in the text waiting to be retrieved. It is produced through the interaction of text, reader, historical context, and critical methods. Reader response theorists like Stanley Fish argue that meaning is constituted by interpretive communities, not by text alone. So this is what the second method, interpretation. And evaluation. Let's look at this one. So evaluation is the text good? Arguing for or against its literary, moral, aesthetic, or cultural value and explaining the criteria used. Evaluation is the most contested of three activities. Formalist critics evaluate internal coherence and verbal complexity. Marxist critics evaluate ideological implication. Feminist critics evaluate how gender is constructed. The criteria of value are never neutral. They reflect assumptions about what literature is for. So these are the three activities that you perform while doing a literary criticism. First, you describe something, then you interpret it, and then you evaluate it. Let's move to scope and types of criticism. So literary criticism is not one method but a family of approaches, each asking different questions and priority is different, presenting different evidences. So let's look at the different types where primary focus, key questions, and representative skills are all different. First one is mimetic. Primary focus is the world represents. So the mimic's primary focus is the world the text represents. Key question asks it how accurately or meaningfully does the text reflect reality. Representative skill or classical Plato, Aristotle, realistic criticism. Well, these are important to understand because they are the foundation of different literary criticism school of thoughts. Then expressive, second type. Or orientation, primary focus is the author's mind and experience. Key question asks what does the work reveal about its creator? Focus schools are romantic criticism, biographical criticism. And the third type is objective. Primary focus is the text itself as autonomous. Key question is how do the formal elements of the text work together? Representative skills are neo-criticism, Russian formalism, and structuralism. Then comes pragmatic type, which is primary focus having the audience and its response. Key question is what does the text have effect on readers and how? Representative skills are Horace, reader response, rhetorical criticism. Then ideological type, where primary focus is power, identity, and social relations. Key questions are what does the text reveal about class, gender, race, or empire? Representative skills are Marxist, feminist, postcolonial, and queer theory. Well, these are different schools of thought having different primary focus, so they're very important to understand if one wants to study them in detail. So these are different schools of thought. Mimetic focuses on the world. It represents expressive focus on author. Objective focuses on text. Pragmatic focuses on author and the response. Ideological focuses on power dynamics. Let's move forward. A compressed history. Literary criticism is nearly as old as literature itself. What follows is a compressed orientation. So we'll be discussing it. We're starting from Plato, 375 BCE. Remember, it's not like it started from here. It's dependent on this history, the knowledge of history, that how far we go back. Well, we're starting from Plato as we have the knowledge and we have the evidences of his work. They're quite old, so to go back, it is like going into thin air because it depends on how far we can go. So the history of literary criticism up to the data we have available is starting from Plato, the Republic. Plato's critique of poetry as imitation, thrice removed from truth, inaugurates the Western critical tradition and set up the tension between art and knowledge that has never fully resolved. Well, we're starting from 375 BC, then 335 BC Aristotle Poetics. Remember why that day 375 this looks much more increasing in number as compared to 335. Well, if we're talking about history, remember before zero, well, there's no such thing as zero. So let's take first century. Before first century, that before Christ and after Christ. Well, before Christ, we take the numbers starting from like 1,000 and coming to 1. Whereas after Christ, we take numbers starting from 1 reaching till 1,000. Then Aristotle Poetics, let's look at this. Aristotle's systematic defense of poetry as a form of knowledge centered on mimesis, and catharsis is the founding document of literary criticism as a disciplined inquiry. Then comes Longinus, whose work is On the Sublime, 1st century, the first sustained theory of what makes literature great, introducing the concept of the sublime as a quality that overwhelms the reader and elevates the soul. Then moving forward, we're coming directly in Renaissance and Neoclassical 1580s and 1660s. Sidney defended poetry against Puritan attack. Dryden, Pope, and Johnson codified neoclassical rules of decorum, genre, and criterion of nature. Then Romantic and Victorian 1798 to 1880s, Wordsworth and Coleridge redefined poetry as organic expression. Shelley defends poets as unacknowledged legislators. Arnold elevates criticism itself to a cultural mission. Then moving forward to modern school, 1910s and 1960s, Russian formalism, new criticism, and structuralism systematize the study of literary language, moving criticism towards scientific rigor and away from impressionism. Then we have 1960s until present, which is contemporary voices, consisting of deconstruction, destabilizes the text, new historicism, re-embeds it in power, feminist, postcolonial, queer, and ecocritical approaches ask who gets to speak and whose stories count. Well, this is the timeline. Then key terms to know. These foundation concepts recur throughout the series, so let's look at them. Mimesis from the Greek. Well, this is the Greek term. Comment down below if you know the pronunciation of it. Mimesis, imitation or representation. Aristotle argued in the Poetics that all poetry is a form of mimesis, the representation of human action. The central critical question becomes what is being imitated, how faithfully, and to what end. The concept underpins Western realism and is challenged by Romantic expressivism, which prioritizes creation over imitation. So this mimesis was introduced by Aristotle in his work Poetics. Let's move forward to catharsis. So these are written in ancient Greek language. So catharsis from the Greek, this term purification or purgation. Aristotle's famous but frustratingly brief claim that tragedy affects the catharsis of pity and fear. Scholars have debated for centuries whether he meant emotional purgation, a medical metaphor, a moral clarification, or intellectual illumination. It remains one of the most productive unresolved concepts in the critical tradition. Then we have the canon. It is also a Greek term meaning a rule or measuring rod. The literary canon is the body of text deemed worthy of sustained study and cultural transmission. Canons are always constructed, they reflect the value, assumption, and power relation of those who construct them. Since the 1970s, feminists, postcolonial, and multicultural critics have challenged the exclusion built into traditional canons. So let's look at the next term. Hermeneutics, the theory and practice of interpretation, originally applied to biblical texts, extended to all texts by Friedrich Schleiermacher and William Dalton in the 19th century and radicalized by Hans-Georg Gadamer. In Truth and Method, written in 1960, Gadamer argues that interpretation is always situated. The interpretation brings a horizon of understanding that fuses with the text's own horizon in the act of reading. Then intentional fallacy, W.K. Wimsatt and Monroe Beardsley. Beardsley's influential 1946 argument that an author's intended meaning is neither available or relevant, nor relevant as a criterion for evaluating a literary work. What matters is the meaning the text produces through its language. This essay, alongside their affective fallacy, which is warns against grounded criticism in the reader's emotional response, established the new critical orthodoxy of textual anatomy. Then ideology, which is in literary critical usage, ideology refers to the system of beliefs, values, and representation through which a society or group understands itself and its place in the world, often in ways that naturalizes and conceives existing power relations. Louis Althusser's influential reformulation describes ideology as that which interpolates individuals as subjects, shaping their sense of identity and their understanding of what is normal. Much contemporary criticism, like Marxist, feminist, and postcolonial, is concerned with identifying the ideological work that literary texts perform. So these are the key terms. We'll be discussing them in more details when we cover their respective topics. This is for general introduction. So let's move forward. So this is the series roadmap that we will be covering. Let's look at it. So phase 1 is classical foundation, in which we'll be studying Plato, Aristotle, Longinus, and Horace. Then comes phase number 2, which is Renaissance and Neoclassical, dealing with Sir Philip Sidney, John Dryden, Alexander Pope, Samuel Johnson. And phase 3 is Romantic and Victorian eras, dealing with William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Percy Bysshe Shelley, which is P.B. Shelley, Matthew Arnold, Walter Pater. Then phase 4 is modern critical approaches, dealing with Russian formalism, new criticism, structuralism, reader response theory, psychoanalytic criticism, and Marxist criticism. Then phase 5 is contemporary voices, dealing with topics like deconstruction, new historicism, then feminist criticism, dealing with gender studies, queer theory, postcolonial criticism, ecocriticism, which is disability studies, then digital humanities, post-humanism. Well, these are topics that we will covering. If there's much more, we'll discuss them later, but these are the general ones that are decided for this series. So these are the references from where the data is actually taken for this first episode. You can pause it and read this work in detail if you want to. So that's it for today. I hope you understand it and like the topic. Please do like, subscribe and share, and do comment. That is very important for us and it encourages us to do much more for the channel. That's it for today. I hope you like the video. Thanks for watching. Have a good day.